White billionaire rips black maid's dress at party. Then her husband cancels their $100 billion deal. Billionaire's $100 billion deal shattered in seconds. All because he humiliated the wrong woman. At a lavish party, a wealthy white billionaire humiliates a black maid by ripping her dress in front of guests. What he doesn't realize is that her husband is a powerful businessman negotiating a massive $100 billion deal with him. Outraged, the husband cancels the agreement on the spot. The billionaire's arrogance costs him everything. The night glittered with chandeliers, every crystal shimmering like a fragment of starlight trapped inside the grand ballroom. The world's elite gathered under one gilded roof, their laughter echoing like the ringing of coins, their jewels reflecting the weight of wealth and influence. Every step across the polished marble floor seemed to declare ownership of power, as if the very air belonged only to those born into privilege. Yet among the tuxedos and gowns, among the million-dollar smiles and champagne glasses, stood someone invisible, someone deemed beneath the spectacle. She was a maid, her uniform simple, her movements rehearsed with quiet grace. Her presence existed only for service, her face hardly acknowledged, though it was as human as any that turned to the sound of the music. Her hands, worn from work, carried trays of glasses with the patience of one who had labored all her life. She moved like a shadow in a room of glittering light, unnoticed except when needed. But fate is cruel in the way it tests dignity. The billionaire host, white, powerful, drunk on his own arrogance, noticed her as if she were not a woman but an object, a stage prop in his performance of dominance. His laughter cut through the ballroom like a blade, loud enough to silence the whispers, sharp enough to make eyes turn. And in a moment that froze the night, he reached for her. Fingers wrapped in arrogance tore the fabric of her dress, shredding not only cloth but dignity. Gasps filled the room. Crystal glasses trembled in stunned hands. Every face stared, some with pity, some with horror, others with cruel amusement. The maid's face burned with humiliation, her eyes heavy with a pain no one there could carry. She stood frozen, her body exposed not only in cloth but in soul, stripped before those who lived to consume spectacle. She was not seen as a woman, not seen as human, but reduced to entertainment in the eyes of one man who thought himself untouchable. And yet, what the billionaire could not see was that this moment was not small, not trivial, not disposable. This moment would carry the weight of empires. Because hidden beneath her silence, unseen beneath her lowered gaze, was a truth he did not know. She was not just a maid. She was a wife. And her husband was not an ordinary man. He was seated among the guests that night, a man of power clothed in quiet authority, a man who carried the future of a $100 billion deal in his hands. He watched everything. His eyes followed the arrogant display, his heart recoiled at the wound inflicted upon the woman who had stood beside him through struggle and sacrifice. In that moment, the glitter of chandeliers dimmed. The gold lost its shine. The laughter of the rich soured into mockery. All he saw was the woman he loved, humiliated by a man who believed wealth excused cruelty. The room returned to motion, music playing again, whispers flowing like poison rivers around the maid. But a storm was building, quiet, unseen, yet inevitable. Because while the billionaire thought he had only torn a dress, what he had truly ripped apart was his own empire. For dignity is worth more than contracts. Respect is more valuable than profit. And love cannot be bought, sold, or disrespected without consequence. The maid stood trembling, but she was not alone. Unseen to the billionaire, her husband's silence was not weakness. It was thunder waiting for its moment to strike. The night continued as if nothing had happened, but under the surface of champagne bubbles and music, the ground was already cracking. Every deal made that evening, every handshake, every promise, would be overshadowed by the choice he was about to make. And when the world discovered the weight of that choice, they would know that a dress torn in arrogance could unravel fortunes built over lifetimes. The night was not yet over. But for the billionaire, his empire had already begun to collapse. The ballroom glittered on, but beneath the chandeliers, silence hung heavier than the music. People smiled, their masks of wealth unbroken, yet every glance betrayed discomfort. The maid retreated to the shadows, her dignity wrapped in invisible scars, her face etched with a quiet strength that refused to break. She had been shamed, yes, but she had not been destroyed. And that truth unsettled more than her humiliation ever could. Her husband watched her disappear beyond the velvet curtains. Each step she took a blade cutting into his soul. The sight of her torn dress, the soundless weight of her humiliation, ignited something within him that no amount of wealth could silence. He had spent decades building an empire, clawing his way from nothing to power, his name carried across continents. Yet in this single moment, all his victories meant nothing compared to the dishonor cast upon the woman who had shared his struggle. The billionaire continued his laughter, unaware of the ruin he had summoned upon himself. He believed his wealth was a shield, his arrogance a crown, his cruelty a privilege. To him, the maid was nameless, faceless, powerless. To him, she was nothing more than the background to his glory. He did not know that she was the cornerstone of a man's empire, the heart of his life, and the soul behind the billion-dollar negotiations that had brought him into this very ballroom. And so, while the billionaire toasted to himself, the husband made a decision. A decision born not of anger alone, but of love, of loyalty, and of a refusal to let cruelty triumph unchecked. The $100 billion deal, the largest in his company's history, the future of industries, the promise of jobs, the legacy of wealth, would end tonight. The whispers began to ripple across the room. Executives leaned in, curious at the quiet storm brewing in the husband's expression. Investors sensed the air tightening, as though the walls themselves knew history was being written. The billionaire, blinded by his own reflection in champagne glass and gold, remained oblivious. He did not see the future crumbling beneath his feet. The husband's decision was not sudden. It was forged in the fire of his past. He remembered the days when he and his wife had nothing, when she stitched his shirts by hand, when she carried burdens heavier than her own frame. He remembered the nights when she cleaned offices, her hands raw, her back bent, while he dreamed of a future they could share. Together, they had endured ridicule, poverty, rejection. Together, they had built their rise. Every victory he achieved was not his alone, but hers. She was the foundation of his empire, the silent partner in his every success. And now, in this hall of false gods, a man with too much wealth and too little humanity had dared to dishonor her. The husband knew then that no amount of profit could justify silence. No sum of money could purchase his integrity or her dignity. The moment of reckoning arrived quietly. Contracts unsigned, handshakes withheld, promises left dangling like broken chandeliers. One by one, the husband pulled back from the negotiations. His absence at the discussion table spoke louder than any outburst ever could. Those who understood the value of silence recognized the storm approaching. The billionaire, finally aware of unease, searched for answers in the faces around him. Yet all he saw were shadows. All he felt was a sudden chill creeping into his empire. By midnight, word spread through the ballroom like wildfire. The deal was dead. The $100 billion empire to be had vanished before it could even be born. And though no announcement thundered from the husband's lips, everyone knew why. The maid's torn dress had become the symbol of arrogance punished. The humiliation meant for one woman had become the undoing of an empire. But the night was not finished. For while the billionaire reeled in disbelief, unable to comprehend how his empire could collapse over what he considered a small act, the husband stood alone in quiet defiance. His silence was not weakness. It was the voice of generations who had endured disrespect and risen above it. It was the reminder that money cannot erase cruelty, and no amount of wealth can protect arrogance from justice. The ballroom emptied with unease. The billionaire remained, staring at the ruins of his pride. The maid's husband left with nothing but his wife's hand in his own. For him, that was the only empire worth protecting. Yet outside those golden doors, the world waited. The press, the investors, the public, all hungering for an explanation, a headline, a truth. The storm had only just begun, and its waves would soon reach far beyond the walls of that glittering hall. The night was over, but the reckoning was only beginning. The morning light fell upon headlines that burned like fire across every newspaper, every screen, every whispered conversation in boardrooms. The deal is dead. A $100 billion empire collapsed before it was born. Investors panicked, shareholders questioned, rivals celebrated. But beyond the numbers, beyond the contracts and projections, a deeper truth emerged. Arrogance had been exposed, and dignity had claimed its price. The billionaire's name, once spoken with reverence, became a cautionary tale. His image of power dissolved into ridicule, his empire shaken by distrust. He had built towers of glass and steel, yet all crumbled under the weight of his own cruelty. No one wished to stand beside a man who could humiliate the vulnerable, for if he could tear the dress of a maid in public, what greater destruction might he bring in private? Wealth, once his shield, had become his prison. But in another home, smaller, humbler, filled with warmth, the maid and her husband sat together in silence. They had not sought this storm. They had not wished for spectacle. They had only wanted respect. She held her torn dress in her hands, not as a reminder of shame, but as proof of resilience. She had stood before the eyes of the world, humiliated yet unbroken. And because her husband had chosen dignity over profit, she knew she had never stood alone. Their sacrifice was real. The $100 billion deal would have secured power for generations, opening doors that few could imagine. Yet he had given it up in a heartbeat, for her, for their love, for the unshakable belief that no wealth could outweigh dignity. And then, the unexpected happened. In the days that followed, voices rose, not in mockery, but in solidarity. Leaders, activists, workers, even fellow tycoons who had known the sting of arrogance themselves, spoke his name with respect. Investors once tied to the billionaire turned instead to him, offering partnerships built not on greed but on trust. Where one empire collapsed, another began to rise, not built on exploitation, but on integrity. For when the world saw the truth, it could not look away. It saw a man who had sacrificed fortune for love. It saw a woman who had endured humiliation but emerged with strength unbroken. And together, they became more than symbols of wealth. They became symbols of justice. The maid returned to her life not as a shadow in the ballroom, but as a woman whose dignity had rewritten the story of power. No longer invisible, she became the heart of a narrative that stretched across continents. Her torn dress, once a wound, transformed into a banner of resistance, proof that even in silence, humanity speaks louder than arrogance. The billionaire, meanwhile, stood in the ruins of his empire, surrounded by the hollow echoes of his own pride. He had lost more than money. He had lost trust, respect, and the one thing he could never buy back, his name. The cost of cruelty had revealed itself, and no wealth could hide its debt. And so, the story closed not with the glitter of chandeliers, but with the quiet glow of justice. A love that had endured poverty, risen to wealth, and faced humiliation emerged stronger than any empire of gold. Because in the end, true wealth is not measured in billions. It is measured in dignity kept, in sacrifices made, and in love that endures when the world demands its price. The maid and her husband walked forward, hand in hand, leaving behind not only the ruins of arrogance, but also the reminder that respect is the highest currency of all. And as the world whispered their story, one truth echoed louder than all others. Empires fall,